Good evening, everyone. I'm WSAV News 3 Coastal Sunrise anchor Kim Gusby. The coastal empire in Low Country was the stage of many important events in America's Black history journey. As two of the 13 original colonies and key states in the Old South and Southern Confederacy, Georgia and South Carolina would play a pivotal role in the African American struggle for equality and civil rights. We want to share some of those stories with you this evening. We begin in the Low Country. When you think of Hilton Head Island, pristine beaches and golf resorts probably come to mind. But did you know that Hilton Head is also home to our nation's first African-American self-governing community? Tonight, we take you to Mitchellville, South Carolina, a small town that played a big part in shaping history. It's an area well-traveled, but truly not very well known. In the 1860s, this parcel of land was known as Mitchellville, South Carolina.
Mitchellville was a black freedmen's village after the Civil War that actually was planned as early as 1861 and 1862, specifically after the Union forces captured Hilton Head.
Located at the northern end of the island, the community covered 150 acres and at one time had a population of about 1,500. Built during the Civil War, this area gained a lot of attention for creating a sustainable, self-governing community of freed slaves. Named after its organizer, Union Army General Ormsby Mitchell, the village was considered an experiment in freedom, marking a turning point in history.
This crowning achievement, of course, what they remember him for in the history books, is planning and making Mitchellville possible for African Americans, for their freedom then and for the legacy that we're talking about right now.
The land was divided into districts, and the people elected their own leaders. The mayor of Mitchellville was Reverend Abraham Murchison, a former deacon at Savannah's First Bryan Baptist Church. He came to South Carolina and formed a church of his own, which still stands today. March Haynes, a deacon out of Savannah's First African Baptist, served as the town's marshal. Haynes was a commando spy at Fort Pulaski and Underground Railroad conductor. They, along with the town council, established the first compulsory education law in South Carolina. This one-room schoolhouse, built years later, kept its doors open until 1954. It's the only one still standing in the state. With the passage of time, Mitchellville disappeared, and freed slaves settled on other parts of the island. Today, many who have ties to the community want to bring it back. Herbert Ford's family has lived on the island for generations.
My parents and foreparents lived in this community. My family heritage is originally from the Drayton clan, and Mitchellville was a part of the Drayton plantation.
Ford is now chairman of a planning committee that's working to make sure Mitchellville isn't forgotten and that this important piece of the past has its place in today's history.
What we have been told by the local Chamber of Commerce is that we have about 2 million visitors that come to Hilton Head on an annual basis. About 30% of those visitors are interested in history. So this would be an opportunity for them to experience history that occurred back in the 1800s. And it's not only a part of the history of South Carolina, but it's a part of the history of our nation.
The site was placed on the National Registry of Historic Places in 1988. 7 years ago, the Mitchellville Preservation Project was established to protect what remains of the area as a historic site. Hilton Head and Beaufort recently bought almost 2 acres at the site for the Preservation Project. As we celebrate Black History Month, we take a look at some of the people and places that helped shape our area. Let's go now down to the Diamond Causeway, to the quiet community of Pinpoint. The small settlement stretches less than a mile from end to end, but its history spans generations. If you want to know about the history of Pinpoint, just ask the people who live here.
When we were growing up, it was the neighborhood, and everybody was looking out for everybody.
Like many of their neighbors, John Haynes and brothers Charles and Tyrone Harris were born on this land. They remember growing up during a time when life was simple, secluded, and seemingly untouched by the outside world.
But we had lamps like that lamp up there. And that was how we see at night. We had no gas. We had to cut wood, cook and heat with wood.
They grew what they consumed, and what they didn't grow, they caught in the river nearby.
I could have provided for my family, because if I ran short of money or my refrigerator got empty, I could go in the river and catch them something to eat.
There are no strangers here. Folks were connected by friendship or kinship, and they lived one of two places, up the street or down the street.
The road was everybody's gathering place. And the gospeliers, they started out by getting together as young men in the evening and singing in the road. And they've had an illustrious career since then.
It's these stories, this culture, that Armstrong Atlantic history professor Dr. Barbara Furtick is hoping will be preserved. She's been studying Pinpoint since the early 90s.
This is much more than an African-American story. It's an American story about people who made their way.
They are the descendants of freed slaves who sailed from Ossabaw and other islands to make a home inland. Pieces of the past are still very much a part of this close-knit community, like Sweet Fields of Eden Church, a place of worship that has stood at the corner of Lehigh and Pinpoint Avenues for more than a century. Next to it, a graveyard where many of their ancestors are buried. There's a social hall that was built in the 1920s, and the structure that was once the economic heart of this waterfront neighborhood, the A.S. Varnon Sons Oyster and Crab Company.
It was the crab factory most down that side where mostly everybody worked at. And we would scrub crab, the backs of the crab, we would scrub it, put it in a tub and with a brush and clean them.
The company opened its doors in 1926. It closed nearly 60 years later. But not everyone made their living crabbing.
Most of the young fellas that from out here worked with my father. He trained them how to be carpenters.
But it's the hard work of its most famous son, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, that earned Pinpoint a place on the map.
What he says about it is that his grandfather raised him to think of being free of the restrictions, but his grandfather did it through choosing to farm and through hard work. He chose it through learning.
Many will quickly point out, though, that Justice Thomas isn't the only product of Pinpoint. There were scholars and athletes. There's even a softball team that Haynes refers to as a dynasty.
The Pinpoint Rams started by Joe Louis Bowens, and we had little parties at the hall, pay a little dues, and we was able to purchase some red and white jerseys with khaki pants, and that was our uniform.
Just like the church, the social hall, and the A.S. Barn building, the team is still around, and so are the memories. It seems folks of Pinpoint have a hard time letting go of the past, and they want to keep it that way. In November of last year, a historical marker was dedicated to preserve the rich culture of Chatham County's first unincorporated historic district. The old A.S. Varn building was also converted into what is now the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, a facility that shares the fascinating story of that community and the people who've lived there for generations. Join WSAV in celebrating Black history. I'm Kim Gusby. On May 1st, 1947, they changed the face of law enforcement in the South and did something no other African American had been able to do east of the Mississippi by becoming Savannah police officers. They proudly carried the name the Original Nine, and their courage to serve and protect paved the way for generations.
Learn more at WSAV.com, keyword Black History, proudly brought to you by Progressive Insurance.
They were the first black regiments of the U.S. Army, but the role of the Buffalo Soldiers was rarely acknowledged at home or in history. That was the case of one local hero whose service during World War II was forgotten for more than half a century. Though their numbers are rapidly fading, he's one of the few still around to tell his story. His flag waves proudly from his front porch. Inside his home, his mantle adorned with military honors. Although it's been more than 6 decades since 89-year-old Cleveland Glover enlisted in the United States Army, it wasn't until last year that his sacrifice to his country was finally recognized. He thought the day would never come, but on November 3, 2010, Sergeant Glover stood before family, friends, and top military brass to receive a letter of proclamation for his service during World War II. He was also presented with a Congressional Letter of Honor, a letter of accommodation, and a medal for being a prisoner of war.
I was captured the night in November 1944.
Glover was a POW for nearly 5 months. He recalls being transported to a prisoner of war camp in Moosburg, Germany.
First, they take us in Germany to Starlot 7A. And we got in there. There was more people in there than I thought.
Glover was a combat soldier, an uncommon assignment for African-American men during World War II. Segregation, however, was still a very common sign of the times, even in fierce battle in a foreign land.
I would put it like this. They had a fence between the white soldiers, the Buffalo soldiers over there, the white, and we. And you ain't allowed to go over their part. They ain't allowed to come over your part. So I call that segregation too.
He fought in Italy with the 92nd Infantry Division, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The tradition of the Buffalo Soldiers dates back to the late 1860s, when African-American soldiers volunteered for duty in the West. It was a term coined by American Indians, who gave all black Army regiments that name. The 92nd ID was one of 3 segregated black divisions at that time, but the only one on the front line.
We do hard training, and we had to do hard fighting. I call it overseas. But it didn't help all that much because a lot of them got killed.
Like many of his comrades, Glover was wounded during service, injured in the neck by shrapnel.
I don't know how I got wounded. Like I told them, I don't know how, but I had blood all around my neck part.
He returned home from the war a changed man, while the country he'd left for battle remained the same.
When I came back, I was expecting it to be different than before after I've been in the service and fighting going on. But it was no different.
Glover says the military promised to mail him the medals that he earned, but he never received them. With little more than his memories, Glover kept many of his stories to himself, sharing his experience with only a few. But it was through a twist of fate that somehow those stories bent the ear of Jerry Walker, 66 years later.
There's something about him that just stuck with me, and I didn't want to let it go.
Just so happens Walker is the Chatham County chapter commander of the Military Order of the Purple Heart. He vowed to get Glover the recognition he says is well-deserved and long overdue.
I call him American hero. And by him telling me about what happened during the prisoner of war camp, a lot of them was beaten and mistreated by the Germans and everything, and medical treatments. Many of them died from sickness and cold weather and everything, and how he survived, and that was just amazing.
It's because of Walker that the once forgotten Buffalo Soldier is now recognized as a decorated veteran, and the day Cleveland Glover thought would never come has finally arrived.
Everybody treat me good now. Nice. They come, shake my hand, speak to me. Once before, I didn't resist.
Today, the number of original Buffalo Soldiers still living is unclear, but there are more than 24 chapters of 9th and 10th Cavalry Associations across the country. Mr. Walker and others are still continuing to work on getting Sergeant Glover one final medal for his service, the Purple Heart. While some fought on the battlefield overseas, many risked their lives right here at home in a different fight for freedom. Much attention is given to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, but years before the marches and boycotts came a concerted effort for change. In Savannah, much of that change began in the early 1940s with Dr. Ralph Mark Gilbert and the revitalization of the local chapter of the NAACP. We now see how an unsuspecting group of young people played an important part in making history happen. The year was 1943. Parnell Jones was just 16 when she joined Savannah's NAACP. Jones was among 500 young people who became members that year, making history in more ways than one.
There were just so many things that were unfair and unjust, and somebody had to help right the wrong.
Under the guidance of pastor and civil rights activist Dr. Ralph Mark Gilbert, the chapter was the largest in the country, galvanizing change in this community.
But civil rights-wise, they fought against the old system that limited blacks' abilities to vote, and they broke down that system. Well, he was instrumental in working to get the first black policeman here, the Savannah 9.
That was in 1947, during a push to bring pressure at the polls. African Americans banded together for the right to vote. In the late 1940s and 50s, many young people were involved in major voter mobilization drives.
Everybody did not sit in or wait in, but there were many people in this community that gave of their support. Some financial support, bonding the children out of jail, and sorts of things like that.
Jones worked behind the scenes as secretary of the Youth Council. At the forefront, a young college student by the name of Wesley Wallace Law. He would later earn the name Mr. Civil Rights.
Wesley Law was one of the youth movement persons that made them give blacks access to Grayson Stadium for baseball games. And he also fought for some other rights for blacks,
like the right to go to public beaches or sit and dine at local lunch counters, and the right to equal education. Jones had to move to Atlanta to pursue a degree in nursing. It was there that she crossed paths with a young Morehouse student and future minister, Martin Luther King Jr.
When I lived in Atlanta, I was one of the parishioners at the church where Pastor Martin Luther King Sr. was the pastor during those days, and Dr. King, we referred to him in those days as ML.
ML would later become a major force in the fight for justice and the best-known civil rights advocate in history through his work to end racial segregation and discrimination.
These were things, causes that Dr. King wanted to do to help mankind everywhere, not just blacks. We lived through those days, and there are just so many things that young people assume today that it was always this way. Well, no, it was not.
But change wasn't by chance. It was a deliberate choice, an attempt by many like Jones to make a difference, not knowing for certain that they would. Mrs. Jones has continued to support the work of the NAACP and has maintained her membership for the past 68 years. Coincidentally, she has another connection to history. Her husband is one of the first and only surviving African Americans to integrate Atlanta's police department. Well, there are giants of the civil rights movement, those whose names are etched in history for their accomplishments. Then there are thousands upon thousands of ordinary folks who took a stand during the struggle and never wavered, but somehow were forgotten along the way. Such is the story of John Saxon Pierce, affectionately known as Piccolo. Sadly, he passed away in December of last year after a long illness. During the civil rights movement, he took part in several protests in the city and in the Selma, Alabama March in 1965 that would later become known as Bloody Sunday. This is a painting created in 1974 by the late William Pleasant Jr. of Savannah, entitled Freedom Now, Piccolo. In 1991, January 5th was proclaimed Piccolo Day in the city. It's the oldest historically black university in the state. The institution by the sea has been a fixture in this community for nearly 122 years. Although the landscape has changed quite a bit, the one constant continues to be Hill Hall, a grand structure that to this day still stands tall. It's considered the heart and soul of the campus.
It's like the White House of Savannah State University.
Built by students and faculty in 1901, Hill Hall is SSU's oldest existing structure. It opened as a male dormitory during the administration of the school's founder and first president, former slave Richard R. Wright. Since then, it served several purposes.
It's been the college library. It was the student center, the student post office. And then it became the classroom building.
In 1912, President William Howard Taft paid a visit to the school to speak to the students. From 1914 to 1918, the building served as a barracks for African American soldiers training in Savannah during World War I. Years later, it would provide the backdrop for Paramount Pictures and the John Travolta movie, The General's Daughter. Dr. Charles Elmore is a Savannah State graduate, as was his father, his siblings, his wife, and his daughter. He says Hill Hall is where fond memories are made.
I remember courting my future wife.
And history-making moments are remembered.
As a freshman on November 22nd, 1963, I shall never forget it. The student union was the first floor of Hill Hall. I was sitting there looking at television, and suddenly a news bulletin flashed. President John F. Kennedy has been shot.
But on May 8, 2000, that history was almost lost as fire ripped through the structure. Dr. Carlton Brown was president.
And I remember standing right next to Dr. Brown, right outside on this Alexa Circle, and he and I and many people with tears welling in our eyes. And I remember saying, Doc, Hill Hall is like a phoenix. It'll rise from the ashes.
And it did. After years of renovations, Hill Hall reopened in 2008. It now houses student services and administrative offices.
When I was SGA president in 1967, my office was on the second floor of Hill Hall, overlooking the campus.
Today, Dr. Elmore is back at SSU as Professor Emeritus and a consultant to the Office of the President. He's also back in Hill Hall, where his office, this time on the third floor, still provides a really nice view, overlooking a banner bearing the words of the school's first president. And tell them, we are rising. Hill Hall is named in honor of Walter Bernard Hill, a chancellor of the University of Georgia. In 1981, it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 2001, the Georgia Historical Society and the Savannah State University National Alumni Association erected a marker. Thanks for allowing us to share these stories of the Coastal Empire and Low Country's Black history journey with you this evening. To learn more, go to WSAV.com, keyword Black History. For WSAV, I'm Kim Gusby. Thanks for watching.